When millions of Epstein-related documents surfaced, the internet didn't slow down. It didn't verify. It jumped straight to conclusions. Suddenly, stories began to circulate. Whispers about secret parties, closed-door gatherings, late-night events far from cameras, and relationships no one could see, but everyone talked about. Claims of invite-only nights, restricted access rooms, young faces at powerful parties, and connections that were never explained. One name started appearing again and again, not in courtrooms, but in headlines, posts, and viral lists. Tonight, we're not here to accuse. We're here to ask one question. Is this an exposure? Or is this how rumors become truth in the Epstein Files era? When the Epstein documents began flooding the internet, something unusual happened. Before journalists finished reading, before lawyers analyzed context, before courts clarified meaning, the public had already decided who was suspicious. Lists started circulating, screenshots, threads, videos with ominous music and confident voices. And slowly, one of the most powerful names in music began appearing in places it had never appeared before. Jay-Z, not in an indictment, not in a courtroom, but in online claims, framed carefully, repeated endlessly, and amplified without proof. The accusations were rarely direct. They didn't need to be. Instead, they relied on implication. Phrases like inappropriate associations began appearing beside his name. Vague references to young girls, hints about things that happened behind closed doors. Nothing concrete, nothing verifiable, but enough to plant an idea. The power of these claims wasn't in what they said, it was in what they allowed the viewer to imagine. Behind closed doors is one of the most dangerous phrases in modern scandal culture. It suggests secrecy, it suggests intent, and after Epstein, it suggests guilt. But closed doors didn't start with Epstein. In celebrity culture, closed-door parties have existed for decades. Private guest lists, security-controlled entrances, no phones, no cameras. These environments were designed to prevent leaks, protect privacy, and avoid chaos, especially for figures whose every move could become a headline. For years, this was understood. Then everything changed. When Epstein's crimes became public, the meaning of privacy was rewritten overnight. Secrecy was no longer neutral. It became suspicious. And suddenly, any celebrity who valued privacy became a target for speculation. Online narratives began to stitch together unrelated elements. Elite parties, wealth, influence, and the assumption that power must hide something. Jay-Z's name entered this conversation not because of evidence, but because of proximity to status. Billionaires attract suspicion, silence invites interpretation, and fame turns rumor into currency. Posts began claiming that closed-door parties were proof of misconduct, that privacy was a shield, that invitation only meant exclusion for a reason, but no one could say when, no one could say where, and no one could say who. There were no names of alleged victims, no timelines, no locations tied to documents, just repetition. The more these claims were shared, the more real they felt. Not because they were proven, but because familiarity breeds belief. This is where the line between allegation and documentation matters. An allegation is a claim. It does not become truth through volume. It becomes truth through evidence. And when the actual Epstein-related documents are examined, the standard changes completely. Official documentation relies on sworn testimony, flight logs, financial records, court filings. In those records, there are names that appear repeatedly, supported by evidence and in some cases convictions. Jay-Z is not one of them. There is no verified testimony accusing him of relationships with underage girls. No court document outlining inappropriate conduct. No legal record tying him to criminal behavior behind closed doors. What exists instead is a narrative built on atmosphere. A suggestion that privacy equals guilt, that influence equals involvement, that silence equals admission. This is how reputations are reshaped in the digital age, not by facts but by framing. Once a name enters a scandal-adjacent conversation, it rarely leaves. Every unrelated detail is reinterpreted. Every private moment becomes suspicious in hindsight. And the most dangerous part is this: the absence of evidence stops mattering because the story has already been told. This is not how justice works, but it is how the internet works. And understanding that difference is the first step in separating exposure from exaggeration. Because once implication replaces proof, any closed door can become a crime scene, even when nothing illegal ever happened behind it. As the conversation shifted away from documents and into speculation, when attention moved to a different setting, the night parties, private gatherings, spaces where the public is not invited and cameras do not follow. In elite celebrity circles, nightlife operates by a different set of rules. These are not public clubs or advertised events. They are curated environments, controlled entrances, trusted guests, private security. For artists, executives, and high-profile figures, this world exists for one reason: control. Control over exposure, control over safety, control over narrative. But in the aftermath of the Epstein scandal, control itself became suspicious. Online discussions began reframing elite nightlife as something inherently dark. Private gatherings were no longer described as exclusive. They were described as hidden. Night parties were no longer social. They were framed as secretive. And once again, Jay-Z's name was pulled into the frame. The claims followed a familiar pattern. They didn't accuse directly, they implied. Stories circulated suggesting secret relationships formed during private nights. Unseen connections, unspoken arrangements, relationships that allegedly existed outside public timelines. But none of these stories came with proof. There were no dates, no locations, no corroborating witnesses. What they did have was tone, a tone that suggested something was being concealed, a tone that invited suspicion without responsibility. In celebrity culture, private relationships are not unusual. Public figures often keep parts of their personal lives out of view, not to deceive, but to survive scrutiny. Yet online narratives blurred this reality. Private became secret. Secret became suspicious. Seeing suspicious became assumed. Rumors surrounding relationships thrive in environments where access is limited. When people cannot see something, they begin to imagine it. And imagination, when repeated enough, starts to feel like knowledge. The internet rewarded those who filled the gaps fastest, not those who filled them accurately. Blogs speculated. Comment sections expanded theories. Viral videos hinted at connections they never explained. And with each retelling, the claims grew bolder. What was missing never changed. There were no verified legal records supporting any of it. No sworn statements, no court filings, no investigative findings. In real cases involving misconduct, documentation follows patterns. Complaints are filed, lawyers get involved, paper trails appear. Here there was nothing. The absence of records was explained away as secrecy, a convenient excuse that required no evidence and dismissed all questions. But secrecy does not erase legal footprints. Even the most hidden crimes leave traces when they exist. In this case, the silence was not the result of suppression. It was the result of absence of proof, absence of documentation, absence of any verified connection between elite nightlife and criminal behavior. Still, the rumors persisted. Because rumors do not need evidence to survive. They only need attention. And in the Epstein Files era, attention has become more powerful than facts. Night parties became symbols, private gatherings became accusations, and relationships that were never confirmed became stories that refused to disappear. When this is how narratives are built in shadows, not by what is proven, but by what is suggested. And once a suggestion takes hold, correcting it becomes almost impossible, because denial sounds defensive and silence sounds guilty. But the law does not operate on sound. It operates on substance. And here, the substance simply does not exist. As the speculation deepened, the narratives began to shift again, this time toward people, not places. Claims started circulating about secret relationships with young celebrities. Not names, not dates, just implications. The stories followed a familiar rhythm. A young rising star appears near a powerful figure. A photograph surfaces. A brief interaction is captured. And suddenly an entire relationship is imagined. In the digital age, proximity is treated as intimacy. Visibility is mistaken for involvement. Online theories began to suggest that relationships existed far beyond what the public could see. Relationships intentionally hidden, carefully managed, and deliberately kept out of timelines. But once again, these claims arrived without anchors. No verified ages, no confirmed interactions, no evidence of misconduct, just suggestion. As these stories circulated, some narratives took an even more speculative turn, introducing claims about same-sex relationships. These were not presented as personal disclosures or documented accounts. They were framed as secrets, industry whispers, things everyone knows but no one can prove. This type of speculation thrives in silence. When public figures choose privacy, the internet fills the void with theories. And the more private someone is, the more extreme those theories become. In gossip culture, ambiguity is fuel. The lack of confirmation is not seen as a reason to stop. It becomes the reason to continue. Because if something cannot be disproven instantly, it is treated as possible. And if it is possible, it is treated as probable. And if it is repeated often enough, it is treated as true. This is how speculation grows without confirmation. It begins with curiosity. It evolves into assumption, and it hardens into belief. None of this requires evidence. It only requires momentum. Internet-driven theories do not depend on facts. They depend on engagement. The more shocking the claim, the more it spreads. The more ambiguous the detail, the more it invites interpretation. And interpretation is where truth gets lost. The difference between rumor and evidence is not subtle, but it is often ignored. Rumor has no obligation to prove itself. Evidence does. Evidence can be tested. It can be challenged. It can stand in court. Rumor exists only to circulate. In the case of these claims, there is no evidence confirming secret relationships with young celebrities. There are no legal documents, no sworn testimony, no investigative findings. There is also no documentation supporting the speculative narratives about same-sex relationships. No complaints, no cases, no records. What exists instead is a digital environment where suggestion is treated as revelation, where repetition replaces verification, where silence is interpreted as strategy rather than privacy, and where the absence of proof is framed as proof of concealment. And this is one of the most dangerous dynamics in modern scandal culture. Because once rumor is allowed to masquerade as evidence, anyone can be accused of anything, and no amount of truth can fully undo the damage. In this space, facts move slowly, but speculation moves instantly. And by the time evidence is asked for, the story has already been accepted. This is not accountability, it is amplification. And understanding that difference is critical, because without it, gossip becomes judgment, and judgment replaces truth. As the speculation widened, the focus shifted again, not just to individuals, but to the environments that surrounded them. Secret celebrity relationships, invite-only parties. These two ideas became inseparable in the public imagination. In the world of fame, exclusivity is currency. Private dinners, closed events, each restricted guest lists. These are not exceptions, they are routine. For celebrities, privacy is not luxury, it is survival. But exclusivity has a downside. The moment access is limited, suspicion begins to grow. Invite-only parties became symbols, not of status, but of secrecy. The question was no longer who was invited, but why everyone else wasn't. And in the Epstein era, that question carried weight. Online narratives began suggesting that secret relationships were formed inside these exclusive spaces, that privacy existed not for protection, but for concealment, that what could not be seen must be hiding something. But this interpretation ignores reality. Private events are often misrepresented because they lack context. A closed door becomes a barrier to imagination, and imagination rarely chooses the innocent explanation. Security concerns disappear from the story. Logistics are forgotten. Fame-related threats are ignored. What remains is a simplified narrative. If it's exclusive, it must be hiding wrongdoing. This logic spreads easily because it feels intuitive, even when it's wrong. Celebrity relationships, especially private ones, are often misunderstood for the same reason. When a relationship is not publicly confirmed, it becomes secret. When it is secret, it becomes suspicious. And when it is suspicious, it becomes a story. But secrecy does not equal misconduct. Many high-profile figures intentionally separate personal lives from public personas. They avoid publicity not to deceive, but to protect families, careers, and mental health. Yet online culture does not reward restraint. It rewards exposure. And so private relationships are reframed as hidden agendas. Friendships are reframed as conspiracies. And exclusivity is reframed as guilt. The most powerful element in this process is absence. When there are no photos, people imagine scenes. When there are no statements, people invent motives. When there are no details, people fill the gaps themselves. And those gaps are rarely filled with restraint. The Epstein scandal intensified this process. Once the public learned that real crimes had occurred in private spaces, every private space became suspect by association. The logic became simple and dangerously flawed. Because if one closed room hid a crime, then all closed rooms must be capable of the same. This is how fear spreads laterally. It moves from documented facts to unrelated environments, from proven cases to speculative ones, from criminals to anyone who values privacy. Invite-only parties stopped being social events in public imagination. They became symbols of what might be happening, regardless of whether anything actually was. And once that shift occurs, evidence becomes secondary. Suspicion no longer needs proof. It feeds on exclusivity itself. This is the moment where storytelling overtakes reality, because the truth is quieter. The truth is that exclusivity is common. Private events are normal, and secrecy, in many cases, is simply privacy under a harsher name. But the internet does not reward normal, it rewards narrative. And narrative, once established, is hard to undo, especially when it is built on what people cannot see. As the narratives continued to evolve, the tone shifted again, this time becoming more explicit, more provocative, and more dangerous. Stories began circulating about night parties involving young women. Not accusations stated plainly, but implications designed to linger. The language was always careful. Words like allegedly, reportedly, sources claim. Enough distance to avoid responsibility, but enough suggestion to ignite suspicion. These stories spread almost entirely through viral content and anonymous sources. No bylines, no accountability, no way to trace the origin. A single post would claim insider knowledge. Another would repeat it without verification. A third would add dramatic details that had never existed before. And within hours, a narrative was born. What made these stories powerful was not their accuracy, it was their familiarity. They sounded like scandals people had already seen. The structure was recognizable. A powerful figure, late-night settings, young women and meetings hidden from public view. These were not new ideas. They were recycled narratives, lifted from previous celebrity scandals and repackaged for a new moment. The same phrases, the same imagery, the same assumptions, only the name changed. This recycling gave the stories an illusion of credibility. If it happened before, people assumed it must be happening again. But familiarity is not proof. In legitimate investigations, claims of secret meetings leave trails, text messages, travel records, witness statements, financial connections. Here, there was nothing. No timelines explaining when these meetings supposedly occurred. No names identifying who was involved. No locations tied to verified events. Most importantly, no court filings. No civil suits, no criminal complaints, no sworn testimony. When pressed for details, the stories collapsed into vagueness. Dates became flexible. Descriptions became symbolic. Sources remained unnamed. The absence of specificity was not treated as a weakness. It was treated as evidence of how hidden everything supposedly was. This is one of the most effective tricks in misinformation. When proof is demanded, secrecy is blamed. When details are missing, concealment is assumed. But real crimes do not disappear simply because they are hidden. They surface through patterns, paperwork, and people willing to speak under oath. None of that exists here. Yet the stories continue to circulate. Anonymous videos layer dramatic music over unrelated footage. Commentators spoke with certainty, even as they admitted they had no documents. Audiences were told to connect the dots, even when no dots were visible. This is how viral storytelling replaces investigation. The goal is not to prove, it is to provoke. And once emotion takes over, logic struggles to recover. The Epstein scandal created a template of fear that could be applied anywhere. Night, privacy, youth, power. Combine those elements and a story writes itself, regardless of truth. But when the noise is stripped away, what remains is silence. No records, no filings, no verified evidence, just repetition. And repetition, when left unchecked, becomes belief. This is the moment where skepticism matters most. Not to defend power, but to defend truth. Because without standards, any rumor can become a verdict, and any name can be pulled into a scandal simply because the story feels familiar enough to believe. As the rumors escalated, the language surrounding the story began to harden. What were once described as whispers and implications slowly transformed into heavier terms. Adult misconduct, inappropriate behavior, serious allegations. These words carry power. They can damage reputations long before a single fact is confirmed. But in the legal world, words have boundaries. An allegation is not a finding. It is not a verdict. It is not proof. An allegation is a claim that exists only until it is supported by evidence strong enough to survive scrutiny. Online, that distinction is often ignored. In digital conversations, the word allegation is frequently used as a substitute for truth, as if repeating it enough times gives it weight. But repetition does not turn a claim into a fact. In law, or misconduct is not defined by discomfort or suspicion. It is defined by behavior that violates specific statutes or legal standards. It requires identifiable actions, verifiable victims, documented timelines, and evidence that can be tested. Public opinion does not qualify. In many of the online discussions surrounding Jay-Z, misconduct was implied rather than described. The claims lacked detail. They avoided specificity. They relied on tone instead of substance. This is not how real cases unfold. When credible allegations of adult misconduct exist, they follow a predictable path. Complaints are filed, attorneys are involved, records are created. Even when cases remain sealed, legal footprints appear. Here they do not. There are no criminal charges connected to Jay-Z in relation to the Epstein Files. There are no civil lawsuits alleging misconduct. There are no indictments, sealed or otherwise. This absence is not accidental. Prosecutors do not ignore evidence. Courts do not overlook victims. If credible, actionable proof existed, it would surface, quietly or publicly, through legal channels. The argument that power hides everything is emotionally compelling, but legally weak. Even the most powerful figures leave traces when crimes occur. Paperwork exists. People speak. Patterns emerge. In this case, none of those markers are present. Instead, what exists is a conflation of morality, rumor, and legality. Behavior that some may personally disapprove of is framed as criminal without meeting any legal threshold. Association is treated as action. Speculation is treated as testimony. This is where the danger lies. When the meaning of misconduct is stretched beyond law and into feeling, anyone can be accused, and no one can be cleared. The absence of charges or indictments is often explained away online as evidence of influence, but that explanation requires blind faith in a system-wide failure. Without proof of that failure itself, it replaces evidence with assumption. A reality check demands consistency. If misconduct occurred, where are the filings? If inappropriate behavior crossed legal lines, where are the complaints? If crimes were committed, where is the case? The answer so far is nowhere. That does not mean questions are forbidden. It means conclusions are premature. In a justice system built on evidence, silence in the records speaks clearly. And in this case, the records are silent. The weight of an allegation should never exceed the weight of proof, because when it does, accountability disappears. An accusation becomes punishment. At this stage, the story no longer relied on facts. It relied on feeling. Words like disturbing began to dominate the conversation. Stories described as happening behind closed doors spread faster than anything confirmed. The details were vague, but the emotion was precise. Fear. Invite-only elite gatherings became the centerpiece of these narratives. Rooms the public could not enter, spaces without cameras, environments designed to exclude. And exclusion, once fear is involved, becomes a trigger. Psychologically, secrecy has a unique effect on the human mind. When information is restricted, imagination takes over. When access is denied, suspicion fills the gap. A closed door is no longer just a door. It becomes a boundary between what is known and what is feared. After Epstein, that fear had context. The public learned that real crimes had occurred in private spaces, protected by wealth, influence, and silence. That revelation permanently altered perception. It taught people that privacy could be weaponized, but it also created a dangerous mental shortcut. Once fear is established, it does not stay contained. It spreads outward, attaching itself to anything that looks similar. Private meetings began to feel threatening, elite gatherings began to feel sinister, and stories with no evidence began to feel believable simply because they fit the pattern. This is how Epstein-related fear amplifies unrelated stories. The details no longer need to match. Only the atmosphere does. If a setting feels exclusive, it feels guilty. If a gathering is private, it feels hidden. If a story is disturbing enough, it feels true. In this environment, logic becomes optional. The mind starts connecting dots that were never meant to be connected. Association replaces causation, suspicion replaces proof. And once that shift occurs, even silence becomes dangerous. A lack of response is framed as avoidance. A lack of documentation is framed as suppression. A lack of evidence is framed as how powerful secrets work. This creates a narrative that cannot be disproven because it does not rely on facts to begin with. At this point, media responsibility becomes critical. There is a clear line between investigating wrongdoing and manufacturing suspicion, between reporting what is known and dramatizing what is imagined. But sensationalism thrives where fear exists. Headlines that ask questions they cannot answer generate clicks. Stories framed as mysteries invite speculation. Ambiguity becomes a business model. In this process, restraint disappears. Context is removed. Language is sharpened. And stories are packaged to provoke reaction, not understanding. Responsible journalism does the opposite. It slows down. It verifies. It resists the urge to imply what cannot be proven. But in the race for attention, responsibility often loses. The result is a public trapped between genuine outrage over real crimes and manufactured suspicion aimed at unrelated figures. This confusion benefits no one. It distracts from actual accountability, it dilutes real evidence, and it turns fear into entertainment. The most disturbing part of these stories is not what they claim. It is how easily they are believed, not because they are supported, but because they feel possible. And in an era shaped by Epstein, feeling possible is often enough to convince millions. This is the moment where skepticism matters most, not skepticism that protects power, but skepticism that protects truth. Because when fear becomes the lens, everything seen through it looks guilty. And once that happens, reality no longer decides the story. Emotion does. As the noise reaches its peak, everything comes back to one familiar setting. After-hours private events, restricted access environments, places designed to keep crowds out, places meant to control chaos, not invite it. In elite culture, restriction has always existed. Executives meet behind closed doors. Artists preview work in private rooms. Celebrities move through controlled spaces because openness brings risk, not transparency. But in the shadow of the Epstein Files, restriction has been rebranded. What was once privacy is now framed as secrecy. What was once protection is now framed as concealment. What was once normal has been turned into suspicion. The logic is subtle, but powerful. If access is limited, something must be hidden. If something is hidden, it must be wrong. And if it feels wrong, it must be true. This is how restricted access becomes wrongdoing, not through evidence, but through framing. Celebrity party culture has long relied on separation, public-facing events on one side, private gatherings on the other. Security demands it. Logistics require it. Fame makes it unavoidable. But the Epstein files represent something fundamentally different. They are not built on atmosphere or implication. They are built on documents, flight logs, sworn testimony, financial records, convictions. They describe specific crimes committed by specific people, supported by evidence that survived legal scrutiny. When celebrity party culture is placed next to those files, the comparison feels tempting, but it is misleading. Similarity in setting does not mean similarity in behavior. Privacy does not equal criminality. Restricted access does not imply abuse. Blurring these lines does not uncover truth. It distorts it. And distortion is where exaggeration thrives. In the absence of proof, imagination fills the gap. In the absence of records, narrative takes control. In the absence of restraint, suspicion becomes entertainment. Well, this is where the question must finally be asked, not emotionally, but honestly. Is this exposure, or is it exaggeration amplified by fear, timing, and repetition? A real exposure withstands scrutiny. It survives cross-examination. It produces documents. Exaggeration does not. It collapses when details are requested. It shifts when challenged. It survives only as long as attention lasts. A reality check does not deny that crimes exist. It does not silence victims, and it does not protect power. It protects standards because when standards disappear, truth becomes optional. And when truth becomes optional, anyone can be accused and no one can be cleared. In an era shaped by real scandal, restraint feels uncomfortable. Skepticism feels unpopular, and silence feels suspicious. But justice does not operate on feeling. It operates on evidence. And when evidence is missing, the most responsible conclusion is not certainty, it is caution. So the final reality check is simple. Not every private event is a crime scene. Not every restricted room hides wrongdoing. And not every viral story deserves belief. Exposure demands proof. Without it, what remains is exaggeration. And exaggeration, no matter how convincing it sounds, is not the truth. It only pretends to be.